My name is Jackson. I've always considered myself a strong man who is not afraid of the dark or being alone. But what happened during the quarantine changed me forever. When the pandemic swept the world, the government imposed a strict quarantine. Everyone sat at home, communicating only through screens. My job allowed me to work remotely, so I stayed in my house in the suburbs. I had a small house, cozy, but a little lonely, especially at times like this. I never thought that this place would become my trap. The day it all started, there was a regular evening Zoom meeting with colleagues. Familiar faces flashed on the screen as I felt a slight worry, as if something was wrong. I moved away from the computer and saw that everyone was looking at me with undisguised horror in their eyes. "Jackson, can you see that?" asked Jen, my colleague, who was usually not afraid of anything. "What do you see?" I asked, looking around. And then I heard him. A faint sound, as if someone was whispering softly right behind me. But I was alone in the room, I knew that for sure. The whisper was so quiet that I could have written it off if it weren't for one but. The windows were closed, and when I turned around, the sound was gone. Colleagues looked at each other, and then the screen was filled with noise. The internet is gone. I tried to connect again, but to no avail. I got up from the chair, walked around the room. Everything seemed to be in place, but that whisper, it stayed with me like an obsessive thought. I decided to check every room in the house. The feeling that I was not alone was disturbing. When I got to the bedroom, I saw that the door was barely open, although I definitely remembered that I closed them before the start of the call. A cold sweat covered my body, but I pulled myself together. It's just a door that could open due to a draft. I opened them all the way, and then everything changed. There was a mask on the floor, the same one I wore outside. But I left her in the hall. How could she be here? I picked her up and my heart stopped. The mask was covered in blood. Then I heard it again, whisper. But now he was louder, closer. It seemed to flow from the wall itself. And at that moment I realized that something was wrong with me. Something terrible was beginning to happen and I couldn't stop it. I stood with the bloody mask in my hands, trying to understand what was happening. But the brain refused to accept reality. I looked around the room. Everything looked the same as usual, but this mask and whispers that did not stop. I threw the mask on the floor and decided to call the police. But the phone did not work. No signal. I checked the Wi-Fi and the internet was completely gone. It couldn't be a coincidence. Well, I decided that the best thing to do in this situation was to leave the house. I rushed to the front door, but it was locked from the inside. The key hung in place, but no matter how hard I tried, the door wouldn't open, as if someone or something did not want to let me go. I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just fear, it was horror. The house seemed to live its own life, obeying only its own rules. I decided to go out through the window, but when I got to it, I found that all the windows wouldn't open either. They were as if walled up from the inside. Suddenly, I felt movement behind me. The heart was pounding as if mad. I turned and saw a silhouette moving slowly in the darkness of the corridor. It couldn't be someone alive because the movements were wrong, unnatural. "Who is here?" I asked, although I didn't want to know the answer. But in response, I heard only the same whisper, now clearer. It was a woman's voice, full of pain and despair. "Stay with me forever." My legs buckled, but I forced myself to move forward. I turned on all the lights in the house, trying to drive away the darkness, but it didn't help. The silhouette disappeared, but the whisper remained, as if haunting me. I realized that these were not just sounds or hallucinations. It was something more, something that lived here, in this house, long before me. And now it wanted me with it. I knew I needed to do something urgently. The house became a trap from which there was no way out. I felt that time was running out, that every minute I was sinking deeper and deeper into this nightmare. I decided to go to the attic, hoping to find something there that could help me. Maybe there I will find some clue or a way to escape. But with each step, I increasingly felt the presence of something dark and evil. When I went up to the attic, the door closed behind me by itself. In the dark, I began to feel for the switch, but found nothing. And then I heard a heavy breath as if someone was standing very close. My heart was pounding loudly, each beat echoed in my temples. I felt that it was something standing behind me, right next to me. I gathered all my strength not to scream and turned around. There was no one there, but I knew it was something here. It did not show itself, but watched me, played with my mind. In the dark, I found an old chest. It was locked, but the lock looked rusty. I found a heavy object and opened it. Inside were old documents, photographs, but one thing caught my attention. It was a diary. I opened it. The pages were yellowed with time, but the text was still legible, and what I read made my blood run cold. "This place is cursed. All who live here will find no peace. It lives, it feeds on our fears and pain. No one can leave this house. No one can escape its power. If you are reading this, know that you are next." I jumped to my feet and rushed down, trying to find any way out. But the house seemed to come alive. The walls narrowed, the corridors became longer, and whispers surrounded me from all sides. I ran down the stairs, but each step was harder, as if my legs were heavy as lead. Something changed in the house. The walls seemed closer, as if the house was shrinking, and the space was shrinking around me. Whispers followed me, turning into screams and hissing that echoed in my ears. When I reached the first floor, I saw the furniture moving, as if something invisible were arranging it in its own way. They stood so as to block any way to the exit. I felt like a mouse in a maze where every exit was blocked. There was one question in my head. What is it? What is happening to me? I tried to collect my thoughts, to find some logic, but the fear was too strong. My only hope is to find a way to escape this horror. I ran to the kitchen to grab a knife or any weapon, but when he opened the box, he saw that all the knives were gone. They were nowhere to be found, as if they had dissolved into thin air. I heard footsteps behind me and turned around again, but no one was there. My breathing became shallow. My heart pounded in my chest. I took a heavy frying pan from the kitchen counter. It was the only weapon I could find. Suddenly, I had a thought. If I can't escape, I must find the source of this horror. I decided to go back to that chest in the attic. There should be some clues. Something that will tell me how to stop it all. I started back up the stairs, even though I knew it was a bad idea. But there was no choice. On the way up, the walls began to shrink again, and I could feel the house breathing. It was like in the lungs of some monster that was pulling me deeper inside itself. I could hear the walls around me cracking, and the floor swaying slightly under my feet, as if the wooden planks were trying to keep me from moving forward. When I reached the attic, the door was closed again. They opened themselves as soon as I touched them, as if inviting me inside. I walked into the darkness, holding the pan in front of me as if it could protect me. This time, when I opened the chest, something flashed at the very bottom. It was an old key, darkened by time. At the same time as this discovery, the whispering in my head became clearer, as if someone was trying to tell me something. Take the key, open the door, but not the one you see. My heart sank, but I took the key, feeling it warm in my hand. When I looked up, I noticed symbols on the opposite wall that I hadn't noticed before. They glowed with a faint red light, and each of them radiated a sense of danger and anxiety. I did not know what these symbols meant, but I felt that they were somehow related to what was happening. Maybe it was the door the whispers were talking about, but I wasn't ready. Something inside me screamed that this was a trap, that this room was only the beginning of a nightmare, not its end. I stood looking at these symbols and felt the cold slowly fill the room. The symbols began to glow more brightly, and it seemed to me that their light was burning my eyes. I realized I had to act fast or I would go crazy. I took the key and held it up to one of the symbols. It fit the contours like it was made for it. As soon as the key touched the symbol, the wall in front of me began to crack and move. A door appeared, old and worn, as if long forgotten. The door looked very unusual. It was made of wood, which should have crumbled under the influence of time long ago, but was preserved surprisingly well. It felt like they had been here for hundreds of years, but always remained untouched. I didn't want to open that door, but something compelled me. I slowly turned the key in the lock and heard the lock catch something inside. The door opened with a nasty creak, as if it had never moved. It was dark behind them, but I felt that something terrible was hiding in this darkness. I took a step inside, and immediately the door closed behind me. The room I found myself in was even darker and colder than any other place in the house. It felt like I was in the very heart of this nightmare. Shadows began to appear around me. At first, they were barely noticeable, but then they became clearer. They were human, but their faces had no features. They stood around me, not moving, only looking in my direction with their empty eye sockets. I felt my body paralyzed with fear. Something kept whispering to me the same thing over and over again. "You must stay. You belong to us." I realized that they were the ones who used to live in this house. They all died, and now their souls are left here, doomed to eternal torment. And now I had to become one of them. Suddenly, I heard something that made me freeze. It was heavy breathing, and it came from the very darkness, from the part of the room that I could not see. It wasn't just fear. It was real, bone-chilling terror. I realized that the one who breathes in the dark is not just a presence. This is something much scarier, something that had been lurking here and now aimed at me. My hand with the pan was shaking, but I couldn't let it go. I took a step back, trying to escape from these faceless figures, but they were getting closer. Their hands began to reach for me, and I felt a cold, wet touch seeping into my bones. I tried desperately to break free, but the room seemed alive. It sucked me deeper and deeper. The darkness thickened, and I heard something heavy and ugly approaching. It crawled out of the depths of the darkness, making the same sounds I heard in the house. The whispering that mingled with breathing grew louder and filled the room. I saw him. It was not a person. It was something distorted, as if made from the remains of human bodies. His eyes glowed with anger, and his mouth was twisted in an unnatural smile. This creature seemed to be the culmination of all the evil that was accumulating in this house. My consciousness was torn apart. I felt that I was about to be lost in this darkness forever. But suddenly, something inside me gave a signal. This is not the end. There is still time. I can't afford to give up. I swung the pan and hit the first shadow standing in front of me. The shadow broke into small pieces, but there were so many of them. I fought desperately, knowing it might be futile, but I couldn't allow myself to stop. Each blow was filled with desperation and anger, the desire to survive. I heard a scream, not human, but something much more terrifying. It was a creature that had lost control of me. She understood that I would not give up so easily, and just then, the door I had entered through opened again. This was my chance. I rushed towards them, pushing back the shadows that tried to stop me. My hand reached for the exit, and I felt the darkness try to hold me back. But I made one last dash and jumped out the door, slamming it behind me. When I was back in the attic, I saw that all the symbols had disappeared, and the key in my hand had crumbled to dust. I was breathing hard, but I felt that the house no longer had any power over me. I went downstairs to find the house back to normal. The furniture was in place, and the rooms were lit by daylight. But I knew I wouldn't stay here any longer. I needed to get my things and run before this happened again. I quickly gathered everything I needed and left the house without looking back. There was a new life ahead, where there would be no such horror. But deep down, I knew he would always haunt me, and that this house will never allow me to completely forget about myself. When I left the house, the air felt fresh, but the piercing cold still lingered in my bones. I walked down the street, trying to push away all thoughts of what had happened inside. But every sound, every movement around me seemed like an echo of that nightmare. It was only an illusion, but it continued to haunt me. I quickly got to my car and slammed the door shut, as if it would protect me from what was left of the house. The engine roared and I hit the gas, not thinking about where to go. The main thing was to escape from this place as far as possible. But the more I moved away, the more it seemed that I had left something important behind. I stopped at a roadside motel and decided to stay the night. I needed to gather my thoughts and decide what to do next. The motel was quiet, too quiet, which only added to my anxiety. I looked into the mirror in the room and barely recognized my reflection. My eyes were dark, with tired circles under them, and my hair was disheveled and wet with sweat. I took a shower, hoping it would help wash away at least some of the horror, but the water was cold and offered no relief. All fear seemed to remain deep within me. At night, I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up from nightmares. They were similar to what I saw in the house: darkness, faceless figures, heavy breathing. Each dream was even more real than the last. I woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat and realized I couldn't stay here any longer. I took the car keys and decided to drive on without stopping. It was the only solution that came to mind. The feeling that I was being watched grew stronger by the minute. I tried to convince myself that it was just residual fear, but deep down, I knew something had changed. As I drove down the empty road, the night began to close in around me as it did in the house. Only a weak moon was shining, and the lamps on the roadside flickered periodically. I thought someone was sitting in the back seat of my car. I looked in the mirror, but there was no one there. But when I looked ahead again, a figure appeared on the road. She was standing right in front of the car, not moving. I braked sharply, feeling my heart pound in my chest. But when I stopped and got out to check, no one was there. Not on the road, not nearby. The road was empty. My mind was telling me that I was only seeing an illusion, but everything inside me was screaming for danger. I got back in the car and drove on, but now, with the constant feeling that something was following me again. I could no longer distinguish where reality ended and delusion began. Morning found me at an old gas station. I only stopped here because the car needed fuel. My consciousness was on edge and I could barely stay on my feet. I got out of the car, feeling my legs buckle from exhaustion. The gas station was old and neglected, as if forgotten by time. It was dark and quiet inside, and only the old cashier sat behind the counter without looking up. I dialed the number to call my family, but the connection kept dropping. It seemed that all connections with reality were breaking one by one. As I approached the cashier, he lifted his head and I saw his empty eyes staring straight at me. He didn't say a word, just handed over the check. I felt sick and hurried back to the car. As I pulled out of the gas station, something flashed in the rearview mirror. I stopped the car and took a closer look. It was the same symbol I saw in the attic. It was painted on the wall of the gas station in red light, and it was getting brighter by the second. A feeling of dread grew inside me, and I realized that this was not just a coincidence. I suddenly felt the inside of the car start to get cold. My hands were shaking as I tried to hold the steering wheel. I realized that this is not just a feeling of fear. It is something real. Something was chasing me, and it wasn't going to back down. I decided to go back to the house. It was crazy, but I had to finish what I started. Perhaps this was the only solution. Maybe that's the only way I can get out of this horror that has entered my life. I returned to the house late at night. The sight of the house against the background of the moon and the dark sky made my heart skip a beat again. Everything was the same as before, but now I understood that this was not just a place. It was alive and it wanted me. When I opened the door, I felt something had changed. The air was heavy, and I heard the same whisper that had accompanied me all this time. I entered the house, ready for what awaited me inside. The lights in the rooms flickered and the shadows moved again. I climbed the stairs, heading for the attic as before, but this time I felt that I was going to a meeting with something inevitable. My hand was shaking as I opened the attic door. This time, the chest was open. It emitted the same red light that I saw at the gas station. But now it was much brighter, and I thought I saw movement within. I came closer and saw something stirring inside. Suddenly, a hand appeared from inside the chest. She was pale and thin, as if she belonged to someone who had died a long time ago. I jumped back, but a hand firmly grabbed my wrist. I felt the cold seep into my body and heard the same whisper again, but now it was clearer. "You came. You belong to us." I tried to break free, but the hand was too strong. She dragged me towards the chest, and I felt something invisible begin to consume me. It was the same fear that had haunted me all this time, but now it was real, tangible. I realized that I would not be able to get out on my own. That was the end. But suddenly I saw another key on the floor. It was similar to the one I found earlier, but this one was bright silver. I grabbed it, hoping for a miracle. The key began to glow in my hand, and I felt the chill recede. The hand from inside the chest weakened, and I managed to break free. But something stopped me. The words I heard seemed important. Maybe I really did belong in this place. But even so, I couldn't let him win. I got to my feet and started screaming. It was a cry that came from the depths of my soul, and it seemed to tear apart the darkness around me. I hit the chest, and it shattered into pieces, and the red light disappeared with it. As I felt the darkness recede, I realized that this was not the end. Something remained inside me, something I took with me from this place. and I didn't know if I would ever be able to free myself from it for good. I left the house feeling as if something had been pulled from my soul. My mind was so tired that it felt like I was just walking through a thick fog. The car was sitting where I left it, but it looked like something foreign, like it belonged in this damned place too. I got behind the wheel and drove back to the city. The road was dark and empty, and my mind was trying to find an explanation for everything that had happened. But as soon as I tried to put all the pieces together, they crumbled like dust. The only thing I knew for sure was that I had experienced something that could not be explained by ordinary logic. When I returned home, the night was deep and still. I left the car in the driveway and quickly went up to my apartment. I locked the door with all the locks, and for the first time in all this time, I felt at least some security. I collapsed on the bed without even changing my clothes and tried to sleep. But sleep did not come. Instead, images kept popping up before my eyes. The hand from the chest, the red light, the symbols in the attic. I tried to force myself not to think about it, but my anxiety only grew with each passing minute. I felt that the darkness was still haunting me, that it had seeped into my life and was now a part of me. Suddenly, I heard a slight rustling in the corridor. At first, I thought it was just fatigue playing tricks on my mind, but the sound came again, louder this time. I sat up on the bed, feeling the blood pounding in my temples. The rustling did not stop. It became closer and closer. I picked up the phone, but my screen remained black. No signal, no communication with the outside world. I realized that I was left alone with what had entered my home. The sound got closer, and I could feel the cold air seeping through the cracks in the door. I grabbed the nearest object I could get my hands on. It was a metal candlestick. Standing at the door, I tried to concentrate, to force myself not to panic. Footsteps in the corridor stopped right outside the door. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I slowly opened the door and saw a shadow standing in the doorway. It was a human figure, but without a face, without any features. The darkness that filled her was so dense that even the light from my lantern could not penetrate her. The figure did not move, but I felt how it affected me, my thoughts, my will. I realized it was something I had brought with me from that house. It was the darkness that had now become my constant companion. I stepped back, and the figure began to approach. The cold enveloped me, and I realized that there was little time left. I needed to act. I gathered all my strength and rushed at the figure with a candlestick in hand. But as soon as I touched her, everything around me froze. My legs, my arms, my whole mind plunged into complete darkness. I woke up in the morning lying on the floor in the hallway. The windows were curtained, and only a weak light penetrated the room. I had a headache, and my arms and legs felt heavy, as if I had run a marathon. I looked around trying to figure out what had happened, but the figure disappeared. It seemed like nothing more than a nightmare, but I felt something else, some inexplicable presence that remained after the darkness receded. I tried to get up, but my legs wouldn't obey. I could feel the weakness wash over me and knew I needed to pull myself together. I went to the mirror and saw myself. His face was pale, his eyes were red from sleeplessness, and there was a trace of a cold touch on his neck. I spent the whole day in a fog, trying to get back to normal, but everything around me seemed foreign. My apartment was no longer my refuge. I felt that she was no longer protecting me from what came with me. I tried to find a logical explanation for what happened. Maybe it was the result of stress, fatigue, or nightmares that got confused with reality. But when I saw the same marks on my arm again that were in the attic, I knew it was something more. At night, I could not sleep again. Lying on the bed, I heard the rustling return, but now he was everywhere, in the walls, under the floor, even in the air. I felt the darkness return, and this time it was here to stay. Every night became a test. The darkness was no longer just a feeling, it became my reality. I could no longer escape from her. Every corner of the apartment was filled with whispers. Every sound seemed to echo something ominous. One evening I decided I couldn't stay here any longer. I packed all my things and went to the hotel. I needed to find peace, if only for a short time. But even in the hotel, the darkness did not recede. She followed me there too. The very first night I woke up hearing whispers next to my bed. I opened my eyes and saw the shadows in the room moving. They were the same shadows I saw in the house. They gathered around me, and I realized that it was not just fear. It was something real. I tried to turn on the light, but the lamp did not work. Darkness surrounded me, and I felt cold again. It seeped in like poison, and I knew it was the end. Darkness engulfed me. I gathered all my strength and decided to take the last step. I went outside and ran without looking back. I needed to escape, even though I knew I couldn't. Shadows followed me, and I could hear their whispers getting louder. They said I could never escape, that I belonged to them. My run brought me to an old bridge. I stopped at the edge and looked down. The water was black and deep, like an abyss that opened its mouth ready to swallow me. But it was better than letting the darkness win. I took a step forward and felt the cold wind embrace me. The whispers were getting louder. The shadows were getting closer, but I knew it was the only way out. I jumped into the abyss, and the darkness was drowned in water. But even under the water, I could hear whispers. It penetrated into my ears, into my mind, and I realized that there was no escape from the darkness. She was a part of me, and now I will always belong to her. The water covered me, and I dived headfirst into its cold depths. The darkness that surrounded me seemed like it was about to swallow me whole. But at the bottom there was no peace, which I so longed for. Freezing, I struggled to reach the surface, but the shadows were still with me. They pulled me down, whispering their words that tore at my mind. But I continued to fight, even as the water was making its way into my lungs. Gradually, the sense of reality began to disappear, and I plunged into a world where time and space were mixed into a single nightmare. The shadows around me stretched and turned into ominous figures staring at me from all sides. I suddenly felt something powerful pick me up from the depths. I broke to the surface, taking a deep breath of air. On the shore, I fell to my knees, choking and coughing. My body shivered from the cold, but the shadows disappeared. Instead, only I was left, wet and battered, on the edge of the abyss. After I was pulled out of the water, I ended up in the hospital. The doctors were confused by my condition, and I didn't know how to explain to them what really happened. All the questions seemed empty, and the words made no sense. I was on the edge between the world of the living and the darkness that continued to haunt my thoughts. Days passed in a fog. The doctors gave me medicine that was supposed to help me calm down, but I knew that no amount of chemistry could drive out what was sitting deep inside me. My nights remained restless, and every rustle, every flash of light made me shudder. I didn't trust anyone anymore. It seemed to me that every person around me could be a part of the horror I was trying to escape from. Even the doctors and nurses looked suspicious when they entered my ward. Their faces seemed masked, hidden under a layer of something inhuman. One night I realized I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to find answers. I left the hospital despite the fact that my condition left much to be desired. I was drawn to that house, to the place where it all began. I had to go back and finish what was started. When I returned to that house, darkness enveloped me again, but this time I was ready. I knew I couldn't beat her, but I could at least try to understand her. I made my way through the weedy yard and found myself again in front of the old door. They opened in front of me as if they were waiting for my return. Inside, nothing has changed. Dust covered everything around, and the silence was so dense that it seemed as if it absorbed all sounds. I carefully went up to the attic, where I found the signs that I saw for the first time. They weren't just symbols, they were the key. I realized that these signs had something to do with the darkness that was haunting me, but this connection could be broken. I took a knife and began to trace these marks on the old boards of the attic. Every movement was difficult, but I could feel a weight being lifted from my shoulders. As soon as I finished, I felt the darkness begin to recede. The light that came through the cracks in the attic grew brighter, and the cold disappeared. I realized that something had changed. The darkness was no longer all-powerful. I went down to the first floor and went to the exit. The door was already open, and I stepped into the night. This time the night was just dark, but not ominous. I realized that I no longer belonged to this place. I left the house, leaving the darkness behind. My life would never be the same, but I knew I could live with that. The darkness would always be there, but now I was stronger than it. It was the end, but at the same time, it was the beginning. I went through this horror and survived, and it was the greatest triumph. It had been several months since that night that I had left the house. At first, life seemed normal, almost calm. I returned to my apartment trying to settle into a normal routine, but something changed in me forever. The darkness no longer haunted me at night, but the feeling of its presence still lingered somewhere on the periphery of my mind. I started to notice little things that others probably didn't notice. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed too thick. The cold wind howling outside the window reminded me of that night's horror. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was all just the effects of stress. But one day when I got home from work, I noticed something new. The door to the apartment was open. I'm sure I closed them when I left in the morning. Stepping inside, I felt a familiar, bone-chilling chill. It was quiet in the apartment, too quiet. I walked around the rooms looking for the source of this feeling, but found nothing. Everything was in its place as before, but when I approached the bathroom mirror, a feeling of dread came over me. The words, "You didn't run away," appeared on the fogged glass. They gradually dissolved, but their presence was undeniable. I panicked and ran out of the apartment. I couldn't stay in that place anymore. I stayed with friends for a few weeks, trying to regain peace of mind. But wherever I was, I always felt this invisible burden. Something was following me, not letting me forget. One day I decided to return to that house. It was crazy, but I knew I had to do it. I came to him in the middle of the night when the streets were deserted. The house was just as I had left it, but this time he didn't seem so scary to me. It looked abandoned and empty. I went inside and went up to the attic. There I found the remains of those symbols that I had once erased. They were restored. Someone or something put them back in place. I realized that the darkness had not gone away. She was just waiting for me to come back. At that moment, I felt something change in the air. The shadows began to thicken, taking shape. They surrounded me, pinning me in the corner of the attic. I had nowhere to run. They whispered, but this time their words were clear. "You are ours." I knew it was the end. The darkness swallowed me, taking me with it. My existence dissolved into its abyss, and I became a part of what I had been trying to escape from for so long. But even in this darkness, in its very depths, I found something unexpected. Peace. I was no longer afraid. I had become a part of the darkness, and now it was my new home. And though I would never see the light of day again, I knew that out there in the world of the living, my story would be a warning to others. Because the darkness I faced will never go away. She will always be waiting, looking for new victims. And when her time comes, she will return again to take someone else into her cold embrace.